Bush? Is Russia going to invade Ukraine? Is Ukraine part of the historic Russian territory? Should George Herbert Walker Bush have kept his deal with Gorbachev and not expanded NATO? I mean, there's all these issues that are being discussed on a regular basis. But I think the bottom line is, should Ukraine remain a democracy, a self-governing democracy where the people, a majority of the people elect their representatives, or is it going to become more like an oligarchy, more like Russia is right now, a country run basically with an iron fist, as it were? I think this is actually a very open question, not specifically for Ukraine, but around the world, is this question of what's the best way for humans to govern themselves. Keep in mind, for about 5,000 years, the modern recorded history, the majority of human societies have not governed themselves democratically. In fact, democracies have been rare exceptions. Now, again, this is history, right? This is the history of empires, the Chinese dynasties, the Middle Eastern, the pharaohs in Egypt, and things like this. On the other hand, though, when you look at Aboriginal and Indigenous people, you find a lot of societies that are very democratically organized. What you might call democracies. Certainly the Iroquois Confederacy, for example, this is one of the more well-known ones, but there are a number of them. In fact, they were the majority of American tribes, North American tribes at first contact, according to anthropologists like Peter Farb, who wrote Man's Rise to Civilization back in the 60s. But Freedom House, and so, this raises the question, what's the best way for humans to live? I mean, if human history, and even among Native American societies in North America, we had, the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest held slaves. You had down in the Southeast, down in the New Orleans area, you had, pyramid builders and sun gods among Native American tribes. You had some Native American tribes that were what you might call predatory. On the other hand, you had a broad swath of Native American tribes that were highly democratic. As I said, they were probably the majority in North America at the time of first contact. So what is the right way for people to live? Or is there one? When we look at nature, what we find is, up until maybe 30 years ago, the assumption was that all of nature is organized hierarchically, like the alpha dog and the submissive pack. But now we're learning, and I've talked about this on the program before. I wrote about it in several of my books. Now we're learning that democracy is actually pretty widespread in nature. You watch a flock of birds flying overhead, and all of a sudden they all turn to the right. Well, how did that happen? For most of my life, I was wondering if it was telepathy. Well, it turns out that every bird that is flying is voting. And if more than 50% of them move a quarter inch to the right, the whole flock starts, takes a 20-degree turn to the right. And the same with fish and schools of fish and things like that. So, democracy is clearly in our genes, but we keep ending up with anti-democratic or non-democratic forms of governance. And now we're seeing, as I noted, Freedom House, for example, reported this year, quote, "The share of democracies designated not free has reached its highest level since the deterioration of democracy began in 2006, when countries with declines in political rights and civil liberties outnumbered those with gains by the largest margin recorded over this 15-year period. They downgraded the scores of 73 countries that constitute 3/4 of the entire world's population, the United States being among them." Tom Malinowski, the Democratic congressman, just tweeted yesterday, "My office is now getting calls from folks who say they watch Tucker Carlson and are upset that we're not siding with Russia." So the entire Republican Party has largely rejected democracy. They're putting up legislation in state after state where if the majority of people vote for a Democrat, the Republicans in power can simply say, we're going to ignore the outcome of that election. And the people that we know are going to vote for Democrats, we're not going to let them vote, or going to make it really, really hard. So I would say that the real question at the core of the Ukraine conflict, as well as the China-Taiwan conflict, same deal. You've got China, which is an autocracy, and although they are capitalist, as is Russia, capitalism and democracy don't have to go side by side. But you've got China that is an autocracy, and you've got Taiwan that is a democracy. And which will prevail? Each sees the other as essentially an existential threat, or at least China in particular sees Taiwan as a threat. But the story on the surface is, well, this is just a breakaway, territory. So it seems to me that what's really at stake here is whether this consensus that began to form around the world after the American Civil War. Keep in mind, prior to the American Civil War, there were never more than 6 democracies in the world. After the American Civil War, we started getting more and more democracies. We hit a peak in 2006 with nearly 100. I don't have the exact number right in front of me, but it was in the low 90s. Again, depending on how you define democracies. If you call the highly functioning democracies, it was around 70. So we hit that peak in 2006, and we've been sliding downhill ever since. Why? Is this the power of autocrats? Is this the power of oligarchs who want to take down democracies? It appears that that's the case here in the United States, where you've got very, very well-funded campaigns to block small d democracy in the United States. It appears that that may be the case in Russia, where you've got a lot of oligarchs who are not happy with the idea of democracy. And not just Hungary, it's happening. In Poland, it's starting to happen in a big way. We have anti-democratic movements that have emerged in Sweden and Germany and France and the United Kingdom. This is happening all over the world. It's kind of like a backlash against democracy. And, like I said, looking at the history of the human race and even the prehistory of the human race gives kind of a confusing result. And then, of course, you get, Donald Trump. I mean, look at the extraordinary damage that this guy did to democracy in the United States. He came along and for 4 years, openly admired autocrats and openly ridiculed Democrats, small d, people who were leaders of democratic countries. He blew off the EU and NATO and embraced, Russia and China and Bolsonaro and Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mohammed bin Salman, the emperor of Saudi Arabia. It seemed like there wasn't a dictator anywhere in the world, or an autocrat or an oligarch, that Donald Trump didn't want to embrace, and a democracy anywhere in the world that he didn't want to make fun of. And this has now become orthodoxy in the Republican Party. I mean, you had a bunch of Republican senators who went to Russia for the 4th of July. So how does democracy stand? Does democracy survive? There are some very powerful forces. I mean, you've got, Tucker Carlson now openly taking the side of Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict on Fox News. Fox News is owned by the Murdoch family, and Rupert Murdoch is the guy that former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd of Australia said was, quote, the cancer eating the heart of Australian democracy, end quote. And he talked about how, Murdoch damaged democracy in Australia, then went to the UK, damaged democracy there, then came to the United States and is damaging democracy here. Will it survive? Particularly, will it survive this attack from within the Republican Party and from within our right-wing media? There's a great story in today's, I believe it's the Washington Post, about how, it's on the Washington Post. It's titled, Bannon was deplatformed. Now an obscure media mogul keeps him on the air. How this right-wing billionaire has put Steve Bannon in front of 8 million people on Dish TV every day. I mean, it's just amazing. Where do we go from here?